Hi, this is Eric Meikle, and I'm here at Arch Education, and I'm going to talk to you today about IB Paper 2. Now, there's a few key points I want to cover just before we begin, uh, and that's about the goal for the brief tips we're going to cover today. Number one, we're going to talk about fundamental skills that will help you improve not only for this assessment, but also in your English courses in general, any literature courses you have in the future. Whenever I teach a lesson, we're always going to be aiming for the highest marks possible. And in addition to that, we are going to be talking about having the future in mind for possible collegiate level courses. And most importantly, having a positive mindset, what allows us to be confident, to be comfortable in our attempts to go through this sometimes rather challenging paper. So let's get into our first tip here, and that's to avoid a compare and contrast paper. Now, this might be counterintuitive to many students. When they see paper 2, they notice they're taking on 2 texts, and you want to say that text A talks about this, text B talks about that. And oftentimes students feel that just talking about these 2 texts in isolation in relationship to the question being posed is sufficient. But I want you to think back to the actual purpose of IB Paper 2. It's about getting the 2 texts to speak to each other that connect to a global issue, to connect to that global perspective. So this relates to our tip number 2, which is to have a clear thesis statement. The thesis statement is a guiding light for the essay. The whole point of an essay is to write a argumentative point that you seek out throughout the course to support. And where do you lay out that central point that you're trying to argue? That is the thesis statement. If you ever have the sense that you're lost during your essay, that the writing is kind of muddled, you're just putting down words, that's a sign of a weak thesis statement. And last but not least, for full marks for paper 2, in terms of your organization, in terms of the points that you are making, a clear thesis is required. So taking these 2 together, we can talk about how a thesis should be a completed thought. You're making textual observations. I refer to these as a cause. You're noticing certain aspects of the text. You're making a claim, a point that needs to be argued, a point that needs to be supported. And then finally, you're connecting back to that global perspective and the importance. Why do we care? How does this reading of the text improve our understanding of the world, improve our understanding of issues in reality? Let's look at an example of this. So when you get your paper 2, you'll be selecting a question. Here I've selected a question that talks about how literary works often affect views of social factors during their time, in this case, femininity or masculinity. And let's take a look at this compare and contrast thesis. While femininity is often framed as a source of weakness and duplicity in Streetcar Named Desire, femininity is far more complicated a subject in Hedda Gabler, in which feminine traits take on a far more powerful and destructive role. This is a decent kind of surface level analysis. You have points to argue. However, notice how there's no overlap between these 2 points. You're simply looking at them in isolation and connecting them back to the subject. We don't have an elevation. We don't have a greater understanding from talking about how these 2 things work together. Let's take a look of a more synergetic thesis here and look at how complexity evolves. Through Williams' depiction of femininity as a concept defined by the efforts of male oppression, a deeper understanding of femininity emerges in which femininity comes to be associated with other oppressed segments of society. And building further still on the works of Ispen, it can be seen that this association with oppressed segments of society contributes to the association between femininity and illicit or unwanted activity. Here, we're using one of these texts, in this case, Streetcar Named Desire, to set up an initial premise. And from there, we use our secondary text here, Ispen, to build upon that, to show how that when these are taken together, we don't just get 2 separate points, we get a fully fleshed out single claim. This is the guiding light, how you would write a thesis, how you would structure your paper, but the majority of your grade is going to come down to analysis. It is the single most important factor throughout the course of your paper 2. It should be taking up the majority of your essay in terms of just scale. And let's talk about what analysis is. It comes from two Greek words that are simple to understand once we identify them. Analysis is a form of hermeneutics. It's a way of understanding something, interpreting something. And analysis comes from two words in Greek, ana, which means up, luo, which means break. We break something apart to better understand it. If you have any electronics in your room, any clocks, any kind of sophisticated mechanism, think about how you go understanding that. Let's take a simple household clock, for instance. If I asked you to explain the clock to me, you would tell me that the clock tells the time, that it has certain key factors. It might be round, it might be square, it might be black, white. But if I asked you to analyze the clock, you would need to tell me how every little bit of that clock works. Break it down into smaller units of meaning. In this case, for the clock, it can most likely be gears or wiring. In terms of analyzing the text, we're going to talk from the smallest unit of meaning, individual words, and then build up to the largest conceivable meaning. That's the contextual understanding, going back to the global issues we mentioned before. Let's have an example of this. So here I have a passage from Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence. In reality, they all lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. Start with diction, start with the smallest unit of meaning here. Let's take the word hieroglyphic. It's a word that sticks out. It's in an adjective. It's something unusual in the text in terms of its usage. It's fairly rare. And we talk about two things. Denotation, the direct meaning, is a formal system of writing in ancient Egypt. And then we talk about the connotation. This is the most important, and also when you're still first adapting to analytical writing, one of the harder things to identify. Here, think of hieroglyphics. They're lofty, they're mysterious, and also they're impenetrable. Without some way of interpreting them, the full meaning of the hieroglyphics are obscured from those outside. So taking this diction, we look at the device, the second unit of meaning. Here, the device being enacted here is a kind of metaphor where we replace the literal thing, the society of the world Archer, the main character of Age of Innocence, lives in, with a figurative phrase, hieroglyphic. So we just take this together, take that connotation, insert it into where the literal meaning would be. So we take that mysterious, we take that impenetrable meaning, and we talk about how that's being applied to the literal world. We take the structure, this happens at a turning point in the passage, a point of revelation, and now we're able to create a theme. Elite groups, archers from a wealthy part of society, practice forms of communication that are impenetrable to individuals who do not belong to those groups. What this is suggesting to us is that Archer society is exclusionary in its nature. And from this analysis, we take it all together, taking that connotation, describing the place of the metaphor, connecting it to that larger theme, and we get an analytical sentence that can read as follows. The American aristocracy's hieroglyphic nature suggests that Archer society is one that relies upon a system of communication, one composed of nuanced mannerisms and defined social conventions that is inscrutable to those who do not belong to the select few. We're talking about individual words. We talked about the hieroglyphic nature. We talked about how it connects to the device here. This would be the metaphor connecting it to society. We talk about the larger theme that emerges, the inscrutable nature of the communication, and how that affects to a larger contextual understanding, the social dynamics between the lower and upper classes. Obviously, in a full essay, this would be expanded upon, but this is a good example of how analysis can work from taking a simple sentence here, as you see, and expanding it to a nuanced point. And with all that taken together, these are 3 easy tips for paper 2.